And then I think if I captured your question accurately, it's you're asking how people's lack of awareness maybe around what's happening at that level of the nervous system, does that contribute to increased fighting or disagreements?
That's right.
Am I getting that question right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. So it's huge. It's just huge. And so if I were to think of maybe a simple example of, let's say, I don't know, a husband comes home from work and his nervous system is in more of a sympathetic or fight or flight type of energy. He's just more wound up, maybe kind of irritable because of something that's taken place in his day. He's got, maybe to get the kids to some activities at night. He's got some things he's got to clean up from the office. Like there's just a lot on his plate. And so his system is in a more activated state than might be preferable kind of for him. And then let's say his wife comes in as kind of picking up right on that kind of energy, like, oh, there's something in his body language, there's something in his, like the looks on his face, the tone in his voice. And then her nervous system is interpreting that as, great, what did I do wrong this time? And so that might be a pattern in her system that could even kind of predate their relationship. It's possible that she, grew up in a situation where she felt like she just could never get anything right. And so anytime people around her were irritable, oftentimes she would get blamed for things. And so she's like, her nervous system is on edge, like, okay, great, here we go. I'm about ready to get blamed for something. And so she might be, now they're both kind of in these protective energies. He might be waiting for her to reach out to him and kind of like, oh, how was your day? What's going on? You seem like you're in a tough spot. And she's feeling like she has to protect herself from getting blamed for his energy. And now there's this huge disconnection taking place. And nobody's even conscious of kind of like what's going on. They might not be actually thinking those things in a lot of ways, or they kind of are, but it's so linked to these unconscious energies and patterns that they don't quite have language or pathways for discussing those things in meaningful ways and kind of getting at the heart of how do they find their way back into connection and into experiences where they're feeling supported.
So in that scenario you described, I imagine a lot of couples have that kind of thing going on where they're just co-activating, and that probably could play out for years, right? I mean, unless something jumps in to kind of intercede, that could be kind of a very consistent and pronounced pattern in the marriage. Do you see that play out, and how do people maybe start to break out of that if these are like long-standing patterns?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, gosh, this is a complicated question to answer because there's so many layers to it. I guess I would start by saying, yes, absolutely. People could get tangled up in those places because you can just imagine where that type of, if they were trying to resolve what was going on between them without some consciousness around like what's happening for you or what's getting stuck, or kind of having some more questions of curiosity to be able to ask each other, versus if they're coming from the protective assumptions maybe and asking questions. So let's say in the wife's shoes in that scenario that I had created, she is like, what's your problem? you know, what have I done wrong now? And he's like, what are you talking about? You're always creating issues, right? I just had a bad day. And she's assuming, oh, now he won't even engage with me. He won't even give me the time of day to tell me what's going on, right? And so they're just kind of off to the races, all tangled up. And they are never getting at that deeper experience of what was actually happening for each of them in that moment. And that in many regards, what was happening really didn't have much to do with the relationship itself. And so, people get tangled up in those spaces all the time, and oftentimes stay there if they don't have an opportunity to learn some of these things, really. And so I would say the opportunity to start learning about our nervous systems, to start getting familiar with, like, oh, what kind of energy is moving through my body? What kind of a state am I in? And how is that impacting the way that I'm seeing the world or the story I'm telling myself about what's going on in a given situation, is huge. But it kind of, I would tend to say, like, it can be beautiful for couples when they're willing to do some of that awareness building together. They can, maybe find a therapist or a coach or somebody who is able to guide them through that process. But really, if we can take responsibility for our own systems, I think that's where it starts. Because when I become aware of, let's say, again, the wife in that scenario, if she became aware in her system that that story is coming from her childhood, it's not even necessarily coming from the dynamic in her marriage. Like, oh, I always assume that people are upset with me. That's maybe not fair. He maybe just had a bad day. And so I can kind of like, take a breath and be aware of, like, do I think I did anything wrong? And if I didn't, then maybe I just get to approach and say, oh, honey, like, what's going on? You seem like you're kind of on edge. And now I might actually be able to shift. Instead of being in a protective energy, I can move into a connecting energy, and I might become a source of co-regulation for my spouse instead of, when I get caught in my own protective energy, now I may be becoming like another source of activation in his system. And so when we do our own work first, when we kind of come back into, like, what's happening inside of me, what are the stories I'm telling myself that are linked to these nervous system states? How do I move myself into an energy that feels safer, and I get into this place where I'm more available for connection? It just kind of makes all the difference.